Good start. Good morning in California or wherever you are. Good afternoon where I am. Good evening in Europe. Thank you so much for attending our second meeting of our seminar series, Post-Truth and the Musical Humanities. Today, we'd like to welcome Pierpaolo Polzonetti from UC Davis. Oh, and I'm Alexandra Monchick, one of the co-organizers from California State University, with my colleague Wolfgang Marx from University College Dublin. So again, thank you, Pierpaolo, for coming today, and thank you to Kristi Brown-Montesano from Coburn Conservatory for moderating. And our topic today is polarization in musicology. We're very grateful that you could all attend again. And I'm just going to tell you how this works because it's a little bit of an unconventional seminar today. In that, Kristi will give an overview. We will discuss, Kristi and Pierpaolo, some topics. And then we would like to open it up to the floor. And I would like to point to you that because this is a webinar, please use the Q&A tool next to the raised hand tool at the bottom of the screen. And this provides questions with a little more anonymity. And one of the goals of this session is to talk about not the issue at hand, but the fallout and the politics surrounding it. And so we're asking everyone, of course we expect this, of course you expect it, to keep it balanced and civil. So I'm going to hand it over to Kristi right now.
All right, well, I'm going to not do the usual like CV spouting all the credentials of speakers. I will only say that Pierpaolo and I both work in the area of opera. We have a shared interest in 18th century opera, but in opera in general. And we also have experience, both of us, in what we colloquially call public musicology, but working outside the academy with different groups of people who are interested in music or interested in some kind of development or educational opportunity. So, the obvious I think, good jump off start point for us is to go back to 2016 and to a provocative, and I use that in a positive sense, provocative post on Musicology Now, which Pierpaolo wrote and submitted, and it was published in February 2016. And the title, Don Giovanni Goes to Prison, Teaching Opera Behind Bars. And this was for Musicology Now. And this post, which was about Pierpaolo's experience teaching an opera course, the second course he offered at the Eastern Correctional Facility, in a way sponsored by Bard College, he wrote about his experience. And the discourse that came out of this was very volatile, very hot. There were, I would say, it quickly broke down into a very polarized language, very polarized positioning. One defending Pierpaolo and one that was accusing him of, at the very least, tone deafness, lack of self-awareness of where he was in the jail, and went as far as racism, and whether inherent, whether implicit or explicit, and a sense of a little bit the academic elitism and even shades of colonial thinking. So I remember very well reading some of the comments that happened, some of the posts on Twitter and various social media. And what I did note is how quickly it broke down into very angry words and personal attacks on both sides. So it was not a simple one-sided, as I reread some of the comments, which have now been taken off from the archival copy of Don Giovanni goes to jail. We might just say goes to prison. Those have been turned off, but I did get to read an old copy that was given to me so that I could look at those. And one of the most interesting for me of the comments came from somebody who was not a musicologist. And I was struck by this comment and wanted just to put it out there. This was somebody who said, first of all, I'm not a musicologist, I'm public. And I thought, let's just, they've used a capital P, which I thought was interesting. So basically, I don't know any of you and have very much of, I don't really know that much about opera, except for the fact that I've attended one or two of them in my life. I've been on both sides of debates like this. So I thought this was very interesting. And what they said is, so when someone comes out with conviction and concern to criticize the thing we're most proud of having done, which we are presenting to the world as a victory, it can sting a lot. But the fact of the matter is that this is when we need most to be humble and open and to listen, because when we are in the thick of it, we have to be focused, and focus gives rise to blind spots, and blind spots is where dragons lurk, waiting to turn our victories into losses. I thought that was a really interesting comment. And it was a kind of, I felt a kind of weight. The public is saying on both sides, this is not a satisfying dialogue. This has become personal. This has become so polarized that we have there be dragons. And the dragons came out, and, Norman Lebrecht launched on it with his, gossipy kind of thing. So there we are, basically all our dirty laundry in front of everyone on Musicology Now, this outward facing portal. So I wanted to ask Pierpaolo, first of all, how do you feel about this piece and this dialogue now 5 years later? Like, what do you think you've learned? What would you have done differently? Where do you think, I would like to just hear from you about your feelings about the post.
Thank you, Kristi, for doing this, and thank you everyone for being here. This has been a very difficult experience that I had. And I reflected on this during the past 5 years a lot. What I've learned is that it's not enough to do things well or to mean well, but we have the responsibility of monitoring discourse. So the discourse around what we do is as important as what we do, and often is much riskier. So being in a prison, teaching to imprisoned students is felt to me much safer than being exposed to a blog sphere, to the internet, where there is what is missing is the direct confrontation, the direct dialogue that allows to immediately correct possible misunderstandings. So I learned that when we operate in blogs, we need to be extremely careful about language.
Yeah, I think that the public aspect of it, to me, there were two downsides. One is the public aspect of it means that the conversation grows bigger, which can be, I say, downside. It can be great, but it's so wide. I mean, it's impossible to actually have a conversation. You can have a discourse that grows, but you can't, it's very difficult because everybody's weighing in very quickly. And you don't have, unless you want to thread a bunch of, it's an unwieldy way to have conversation. Right. The other thing that struck me is that blogs are they can be quite perilous because of their brevity. So the need to keep it down to a short chunk gets rid of details that it automatically takes out, I think, some relevant details. And had I, for instance, if you had brought this piece to me and the first thing is like, well, we have to blow this up. I mean, actually, we need to hear more about specific things that students were grappling with, or that insights that you received, because with this short, get it down to so many words, you don't get to get into the details, and the details are very important because it's a relationship. This had a feeling of reporting, and what was missing was the relationship. From what I could see, the relationship with this new group of students, very different in many ways from your classroom, but also with some things that are in common. And I wanted to ask you, do you feel, because we've talked about, let's go back to the blind spots. And I'm not saying, like, you've talked about the fact that you've learned, but let's look at the blind spots, because what I saw in the dialogue that followed in the what do I want to call it, the comment storm, because it's not really a dialogue, it's not a conversation. The comment storm that followed was very much around two things that I don't think you can deny, which is that you only describe one student in any significant way, particularizing that student, and it's about race. And you only choose one possible alternative to opera in the things that they listen to, which is rap. Mm-hmm. So can you see this now? I mean, in a later publication, you took that out in some way, the description, you said the second student instead of the second student, an African-American with a large beard. Is there any part of you that now recognizes that this could have been a moment of a kind of blindness, of a sense of, at least, I'm not going to say racism, but implicit bias?
In a way, it appears to be so. But let's. I think we need to contextualize the experience, and that's what was missing from an 800-word posting. Okay, so the context of this was a discussion about Don Giovanni, and specifically about a moment when Leporello and Don Giovanni make fun of Donna Elvira, who is in pain for having been betrayed. So in my class, the discussion started by a white, well-educated man, because it's not that all prisoners are not educated. There were some that are actually very well-educated. A well-educated man, a white man, who said that Donna Elvira was stupid by falling into the trap of Don Giovanni, and that was just funny. This man was actually the African-American man was also a Muslim, and he stood up and screamed that it's never funny when a woman is in pain, when a woman is being hurt or mistreated. I found that an epiphany in a way, because we have so many biases against Black men, and especially when they're Muslim. So there are biases in our society that think that Muslim men don't treat women right, and that Black men are usually aggressive. Now, I wanted to expose this this incredible moment of that seems violent and seems aggressive, but is for the defense of the weakest part of our society. So in a way, for me, it was very important to say, look, you might have biases, but we need to revise those biases by encountering these people. In all the discussion that happened, and I'm talking about 17,000 views of this blog, and I'm talking about an explosion of vitriolic discourse in different other blogs at the same time. In all of these, nobody, and I say nobody, noticed what the African-American student was saying, which I wrote in the blog. So there was no discussion about the words and the ideas and the voice of this man. It was reduced, including by people who were attacking me of being a racist. That man was reduced by an icon, a black man screaming, without any mention of the content of what he was saying.
It's interesting. Okay, so I'm going to push back a little on that, because I agree that it became focused on his race, but I'm going to say that 50% of that, I think, lies in you on how you presented. He repeated 3 times in a frightening crescendo. We had no commentary from you about that moment of like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. We have these biases, and here is a black man that many people would cross the road if they saw him. A Muslim at a time where we are dealing with anti-Muslim sentiment, particularly in the United States. Yeah. And he is saying very forcefully the kind of thing that, frankly, and I did not weigh in on this whole thing, so I was not one of the commentators, but that is the one place that I read and said, thank you, whoever your name is. I don't have a name, I only have a description, but thank you. Because that, of course, is what I wrote a whole book about. Yeah. So I understand that, but that's not what came out in the blog. Is this instead, and this is why I think it's important that we go back and like say what spun out of control, was that you said hoping they would chill out. Like that was, I brought them back to the score and we analyzed the music. And I thought, for me personally, that was the moment where the thud happened of, because I looked at the later article that you published about this, and you mentioned the other 4 operas that you brought out, Giulio Cesare, then Das Rheingold, Porgy and Bess, and Otello. Mm-hmm. And I sat there in myself as an opera scholar, but also as somebody who does a lot of public work with opera. And it is a tightrope of how you could ignore, like I would have said, wow, you are bringing a powder keg of social issues to this classroom. Yeah. And the only evidence I had of when you reached one of those moments where someone could say, I don't care how Mozart framed this, this is misogynistic. This is not acceptable. Like we can't, are we comfortable with, which is something I asked, are we okay laughing along with Da Ponte and Mozart about Elvira? Are we okay with that? We have been. So there was that moment, and I just wonder, did you have other moments that you didn't get to write about in the blog where those insights happened, where you stuck with the, let's say, the provocation that opera brings in its stories to people from the 21st century? Because I didn't see it. I saw, let's go back to 18th century topoi and let's look at what Mozart did and let's like this, and then you'll understand. And to me, of course, my concern has always been that I didn't want to ignore the friction between an 18th century proposal and a 21st century context. So I just wonder if you have other thoughts or experiences with that.
Yeah, well, I want to address some of what you just said. That is so it's rich. There's so much in what you have said. But first, First of all, in your own blog, holding Don Giovanni accountable, which was posted about 1 year later in the midst of the Me Too movement, loosely based on your book, Understanding the Women's of Mozart's Operas. We have, I mean, I perceive frightening crescendos, right? But that's okay. I mean, in a way that when you denounce Don Giovanni, when you denounce, rightly so, the scholarship on Don Giovanni that almost praise the aestheticization of abuse, of sexual abuse, I perceive in your voice a frightening crescendo, but it's a positive thing. So we see the positive thing if it comes from a feminist woman, but we, meaning what happened in the blog, was not perceiving that positivity in the frightening crescendo of a masculine Black man.
Yes, I understand what you're saying, but the frightening, of course, is your perspective. I think that's the problem, is we're not in the room. So
no, I mean, I'm describing a voice,
right? You're describing.
I'm describing a voice which I would describe it in an opera seria, in a rage aria, in a, so the Queen of the Night is frightening. Doesn't mean that it has to be so. I mean, it has to be so. But if you allow me, why bring it back to the score? Because the score is actually letting us know whether Da Ponte and Mozart laugh at Donna Elvira, or whether Da Ponte and Mozart laugh at Leporello and Don Giovanni laughing at Donna Elvira. Because if it's the latter, then Don Giovanni is an opera that actually can denounce sexual abuse. And oftentimes these questions need to be addressed in a very open-minded way, because music analysis is never completely objective. It's not. So I want to engage with my students, whether they are at the level of a doctorate in musicology or whether they are in a prison, forcing them to listen critically and own the score, to say, this is the music that is telling me that there is a voice, that is Mozart's voice, making fun, portraying, framing Don Giovanni or Leporello in the moment in which they look at Donna Elvira. So personally, I mean, I disagree with you that the opera itself is misogynist, but it could be if we read it the way many musicologists have been reading it. So I agree with you that we should give voice to the women in Don Giovanni, we should listen from the other perspective. And the opera allows us to see all this multitude of perspectives, because it's not it has multiple voices.
It does, and I don't want to get too much onto just because the specifics of Don Giovanni and where Mozart or Da Ponte put their thumb on the scale one way or another. I appreciate what you've said. I guess what I was getting also is that, to me, it seemed at that moment when, and I'll come back to the frightening crescendo, is the perspective of the way it was written was that things got hot, right? Like you had an actual, in a moment, the perfect clash. The person who says, she's a fool, of course we're going to laugh at her because she's an idiot, which paraphrases, frankly, a lot of Mozart reception about the opera and about Elvira. And then you have the other side, which was, you know, this gentleman who came out with a strong, and what I mean by this, and I appreciate that you're saying, let's look and see to answer this question. Is it there in the music? Is it there in the libretto? But it was almost that what you said was the frightening, again, I'll come back to this, is, you know, it wasn't, say, with impressive conviction or with all the conviction of a rage aria really taking offense at this, which would have been different. Frightening was you, and then you felt you had to cap it because you said also that, you know, things get out of control in the prison. And that would have been something to investigate, your own kind of feelings. Like, I couldn't get over the fact that I was here with convicted criminals. There was a part of me that was frightened. There was a part of me that thought, what if it gets out of control and they start fighting? Like, I realized that I'm out of my element. Like, so the description we have was from you. So the frightening becomes your feelings of fear. I'm not saying that's because of how it was written. We don't have a, and with that was an, and then I had to get them to chill out. So my point there is not to belabor that, because I think we're all trying to learn something. I'm highlighting that as an opportunity missed, which I think in general happens to people who are out in the public doing public musicology, but also to a certain extent, even in the classroom, that having having things get to the point where people are angry is not somehow, it's like, okay, let's get back to that. But I think that opera, as you've just brought out, it's a thing of strong feelings, of extremes. It's, as a subject matter, it invites, I think, strong responses. And something that I had a friend ask, and maybe this can be something you can weigh on too. She also does a lot of public work, public lecturing. And she asked me, do you sometimes worry or have an ethical conflict about presenting a work or a composer where there are social questions about whether we should still be watching this, whether we should still be treating this as above contemporary critique, as whether it's talking about a songwriter who we find out was a complete racist, or somebody who's been a sexual predator, or you know, even old ones like Wagner being presented separate from his strong anti-Semitism. I mean, where is that ethical place? And you chose 5, well, at least 4 of those operas come with some very strong ethical concerns. So I think one of the threads that was peeping out in the boiling lava that was happening from this, popping out of it through these bubbles, was a sense of, do we have a responsibility to introduce the discomfort? Do we have a responsibility as musicologists to call out the elephant in the room sometimes, to recognize our own discomfort with various works? And your post, I think because you were trying to communicate a very positive experience for you and something that you honestly believed had value for your students there at the prison, is a little bit like, we should teach them opera because opera is so wonderful for investigating feelings, and so wonderful for it. It has this great educative potential, this positive educative potential. And I think a lot of people balked from that because you don't have people necessarily boycotting a Brahms symphony. I mean, they may boycott the ensemble, but not the music. But once you put words to something, you're in the world of ideas. And it's kind of, and this has always been a concern of mine, is once you have words, so you do have people boycotting Akhenaten when it doesn't star a man of color. You do have, I mean, so that place where our social community meets our academic explorations and research, to me is very volatile. And I felt like the tone of your post, which I've made the same mistake, and I'm using it as an example, not as I actually think more public musicology acts this way than it, or goes in with this kind of pie in the sky thing of its immediate benefit, that the repertoire, the ideas have unquestionable benefit. And I wonder if all of us, and that includes many of the commenters that were detractors, if sometimes we don't need to step back and recognize, really, the question is what we do beneficial, and how do we know that? Because that's a question for me. So I throw that open as something that was not the wider thing of musicology. I don't think because you can call, say, Pierpaolo how racist you are, I don't necessarily think that follows that person has thought about about teaching in a prison or even and thinking about where are the ethics, where's that balance? I don't think we've talked about that enough as a society. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about that. I know that was a lot.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're kind of beating around the bushes, but so let me ask if one thing is like, I perceive that the implication of your comment here is that a repertory of operas is not necessarily beneficial ethically.
I think there's a question. I think that is yes, that is one aspect. Is one, there's a question. And the second thing that I have admittedly some, I don't want to use the word ambivalence, but there are moments of about musicology in general. I mean, it's in some ways I have people, audiences, participants, so much tell me the worth, but I'd like us all to, I guess, step back and say, it's a very privileged field. I mean, our whole thing.
Oh, okay.
I don't, whether you're,
no, I mean, that one
that
of
make
the, yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, it relates, one of the accusations, criticism that I received, it was I was somehow the imperialistic, agenda. So somehow you impose an elitist repertory to a group of people that not necessarily have that privileged access to that repertory. So they are at the margins of something. You present it as some sort of, these are masterpieces. If you want an education, you need to appreciate that. I mean, okay, I don't subscribe to that, but first of all, yes, it is an elitist repertory. It's extremely elitist, and musicology is elite in a way. No, it's not mass consumed popular culture. My belief when I started teaching this kind of repertory, both to the homeless and to the prisoners, is that they have the right to access what we consider protected culture. So it shouldn't be protected. It should be accessible to everyone. In fact, there is no correlation between the elite, the social elite, and the cultural elite. And we are talking about, so let's step back. What was happening in 2016? We were in the midst of a political campaign that happened through blogs, tweets, and so on, in which one candidate, Donald Trump, was a socially, super wealthy man who didn't show any sensibility, any culture for what we brand as elitist culture. So it was at the bottom, I mean, much below of any student I've met in prison in terms of taste, culture, what kind of access he has to what we think is elitist. Okay, another thing, so why this repertory? Well, okay, one can read a lot into that, but in fact, the choice of the repertory was mirroring a class in opera and ideas that I was doing at Notre Dame, at the University of Notre Dame. So it was exactly the same. And they would get, the students in prison would get the same education, would get credits for that, so that they could get a degree. So I didn't feel like doing anything different from my other body of students outside prison. One more comment about what you just said, which is these operas might have might seem to have a content in ideas that is based on the fact that there is a plot and there are words. So as you said, Brahms is less explosive as an object of art. However, the reason why I always said go back to the score is because in the score, I believe there are the ideas. There you can see, but it's not as immediate and irrational as when we deal with words. And when I say irrational, I really mean it. So the notes are ratios. The words are in the realm of logos, of logic. So people, as we have seen in that political campaign, were using the logic, the words, the logos, to produce and justify irrational thinking.
Yes, yeah, I mean, I agree that music can be a place where, and I certainly in my own analysis of the Mozart da Ponte operas looked carefully at music. And sometimes I found in music content that I dealt with thinking, well, but this content actually shows us something different. So I understand that. I guess what I'm saying is that opera's fascino, it's lasting, yeah, it's intrigue that people have continued to go see it and are interested in, as a lot of theater and musical theater is based on its partnership with words. So it's meant to be a dramatic thing. It's meant to, in fact, many works were intended to have beyond an entertainment value an educational value because of this marriage of words and music. So I would never exclude the music. I felt, as you almost said, a sense of like, well, but if we go to the music, there it will be rational and uncluttered. And I guess my concern is the clutter is there. And you cannot actually choose one over the other. Like opera, it forces us to consider those concerns. So I understand what you're saying. I just know that this is where I live, in that friction, which I accept the discomfort of that. I mean, I'm about to teach an open class on 2 operas for the LA Opera, and I just carry it with me. So I suppose that one thing that came out of your posting this experience, which I don't want to lose, because even in, sometimes arguments are very helpful to us all. And I guess that's what I saw being lost, right? Is that we can't go into these things naively, and I think we have to live with the discomfort of our subject, right? And recognize it and not shy away from it and be very humble in front of it. I didn't see a lot of humility in the original brouhaha. I saw a lot of hot fire, and a lot of it reasonable. But I'm saying humility in the sense that I think this is a shared problem. I think that
what we are doing now is you know, I say something and you correct my point of view. You say, no, well, you're saying that music is rational, but it's embedded in the discourse. And you know, I can see your point. I am changing my mind. I say, yes, indeed, I can see that. The problem of the discussion happening on a blog is that everybody seems to be concerned about defending a position rather than engaging in a dialogue. But I want to address a question that I see in the Q&A,
Yes.
which is, you know, whether it says, question, Musicology now is an edited blog. I gather that there were 2 co-editors during the 15-16 year in which the blog appeared. Might I ask what kind of editorial feedback you received from them? Did either one of them see a problem with a passage that sparked the controversy and suggest that you rewrite the lead? Okay, so not only there were 2 editors, but I submitted the 800-word blog, very short piece, to a number of colleagues and students, and nobody could see any problem. I presented basically that text at the Juilliard School in 2014. The only comments were extremely enthusiastic and positive, and I was encouraged to post it on the blog. So I see that, you know, many people can say, oh, but you are crazy. Why did you write that way? But it was that sort of blindness, the blind spots, I think are there, and we walk with these blind spots as a society almost, you know, as a group of people. And we can only see it when there is a crash. You know, we have an accident and say, oh, there was a blind spot. I didn't see that, you know.
Mm-hmm. No, I actually agree with that. And by the way, I put that up so that people could see it live. I went ahead and since we answered that live. I do think that it was not just you, and I thought that's what I guess I meant, is this sense of humility by everybody, a sense of we have our blind spots. And to me, the volatility of the conversation felt too much like the kind of conversations, and I'm using that actually in a quote, of the political scene in 2016 and since then. I do believe it was an interesting thing because somebody else brought that up. I would be interested, I'm just going to go ahead and put this up here. I would be interested to hear some discussion about the official response of the AMS to the post and the reactions to it. I seem to recall the AMS basically shut it down and actually silenced it. And
so I mean, to add to that, not only shut it down, it's no longer available. So, you know, I had to, fortunately, I made a PDF with these responses. So I think it would be an interesting case in the future to study, but this has been silenced. So every time we have a problem, the way we deal with the problem is to silence it, not to face it, not to try to engage in a real dialogue about it, but to say, okay, let's forget that it ever happened and let's move on.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think very few people were satisfied with the response of just like, it reminds me of, you know, the morning show or any of those where like, they just go off and they start talking, they're like, pull transmission. I mean, it was that kind of thing, like, cut it. We don't want people to see this. To me, that was like, well, no, but this what you just saw is the AMS. I mean, a lot of issues were no different. I mean, whatever our educational, whatever we have our blind spots. We are wrestling with these questions. And I saw a lot of comments that I got really tired of the ones of like, this political correctness has gone too far. And you know, it's beyond just political correctness, and it's offensive to suggest that that's what's here. It's really about addressing those blind spots. In my opinion, I'm saying, because to not recognize that there were mistakes made in in the published, but all the way, but that those mistakes, and this is where, are not just yours, Pierpaolo. I mean, there's a sense where somewhere in many situations, we, either musicologists skirt their research doesn't have to answer these questions of being a citizen and a scholar and trying to figure out where that is.
Bob Fink, by the way, has some interesting comments you might want to look at them in the chat.
Oh, wait, here I have just, it's in the chat or the Q&A?
I think it's the chat.
Go ahead, because I
wrote that it's a matter of public record that the entire Musicology Now blog was overhauled in the aftermath of this controversy. That seems like a not so tacit agreement that the editing process was not conscious enough to withstand the online environment. This is not true. The AMS response was to throw resources, but I think it was reacting to, the AMS response was to throw resources at the blog to fix it.
Right, the one after the immediate was cut transmission, right? That was made by the first editors was, and because in a way this was welcome to the world of blogs and responses. I mean, this was the forward-facing portal of the AMS and or outward-facing, and this was arguably one of the first crises. And I think there was panic, and people wrote about. I know Kendra Leonard wrote very, I thought very impassionedly, but also reasonably about we need a way to have these conversations. And a lot of people won't even put their names up there because the comments, because they're junior faculty, untenured, or graduate students or freelancers, and they fear the fallout. So I think that was the first reaction, and some of the complaints about even the comment model, the way that's done. But the second would be, I think Bob is correct. I think it may have just come to you somehow, Pierpaolo, because I'm not seeing it, that there was a response, a first wave response. And I know that that's when I wrote the Don Giovanni piece, was for this later group of editors. And I know now they have a whole new Musicology Now template and how it's put up there. And I think they have also a board for diversity and equality and inclusion that looks at at the various things that are being posted. And so you have, in a way, more proofreaders, more people, more filters, more lenses than were there in February of 2016. And with the idea that
on that I disagree, because there were plenty of lenses, but nobody could see the problem until it happened. And the reason why there was a problem is that nobody actually engaged with the truth. It was a completely post-truth nightmare in which people were trying to jump on the right sides and feel good about themselves by pointing the finger at the other side. So the problem is, I don't think it's more monitoring, more censoring, more taking, polishing the language, but it's actually probably the opposite of saying, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Why do you do that? And I think that we are really making, when I published this blog in Musica Docta, I received a lot of pressure to self-censor everything basically and create this different article that presents no problems, in terms of how we deal with diversity, which means either not talk about diversity or frame it in a way that is extremely controlled.
Yeah, I would agree that the way in which we address what I'll call the that friction, those questions, those ethical frictions tends to be, or what came out of that was very much, and this is the subject of the seminar, polarization. It definitely had two teams, us, them, you're right, no, you're right, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. It definitely, without proposing for the most part, or saying, let's step back and look, what is the train wreck that happened here, and how do we all, as a society, address what happened? What
If
are
you don't mind, oh, sorry.
No. What
I just,
do we want to propose?
oh no, if just I could jump in, because at the floor right now, and just because I'm trying to summarize what I'm hearing, and also what Bob is saying, is that I think a lot of this was just the AMS wasn't prepared to deal with this medium yet. So for example, and I'm not harping, the dialogue we're having now is almost like a question and answer period outside a conference after a paper. And so, and while I'm not pointing fingers, if we use the words like tone deaf or blind, which came up in this, and that was in a blog, all
Yes.
of us would be called out right now,
And-
even though we just said haphazardly, where they might just fly by us. And then the other medium we had in previous years was to write a journal article that was highly edited, highly peer reviewed, and then there was often a response. And so this online platform is a hybrid between the question and answer period, I feel like, after a paper at a conference, and also a written response. And so what happened is people could just shoot from the hip, but also have the time to go back and think about it in real time. And I think that's part of it, but I also wanted to look at a couple of questions too in the right now that are.
Yeah, and I do want to just, Ali, one thing I was going to say, both of those terms that I used were from comments. So I was quoting comments.
Of course, yes.
And also blind spots as comments that were thrown out. And yes, I know that there will be authors so that was not intended.
Absolutely.
But I understand exactly what you're saying. Now, there are two questions that I wanted to take this first one. There's some that are still, I'm going to relate to these questions, actually. The first one, I'm interested, and I will put this live, and then I'm going to bring a second question that isn't answered. I'm interested, you both previously talked about how the blog post brought up greater questions of the ethics of musicological work. To whom was the implied community to which the blog post musicological community was unethical? So to whom was the blog post unethical? And then I'm going to go to then Bob Fink has here as well, and he answers some of this. Could we talk about the reaction and feelings of the numerically few younger members of color in the AMS? As I recall it, there was an explosion of really anguished posts on Twitter that echoed onto Facebook, where junior faculty of color were waiting for someone to address the alienation they felt at seeing the blog post come out under the imprimatur of the AMS. I personally would not have intervened at all, but I felt ready to take one for the team as a tenured person who could raise issues. So we have a question there, and then we'll say at least one community that did feel that a kind of ethical, a recognition of the ethical question, of the ethical dilemma. Just one. I personally felt an ethical dilemma with it, but Bob Fink has pointed out something that was absolutely documented, which were these numerically few, but no less important, younger members of color in the AMS. So that would be one. Again, I think that I'm not sure if the anonymous attendee would like to follow up on that. I would be fine with that. Let's see, we have another.
Well,
go ahead.
No, I mean, I have to say that when all of this happened, my greatest concern was that we as a group, as the AMS blog was actually hurting people of color, our colleagues, because they, in a way, you know, we are all talking about not only them, but it was part of the focus, and there was no dialogue including them. So it was really, for me, I honestly, that's when I freaked out. And when I reached to my colleagues in Africana Studies, and I was playing in a blues band with the leader was an African-American minister. And as a jazz blues musician, I was also in touch with many African-American people. So that's when I realized that a dialogue could only happen behind the scenes. None of my African-American colleagues or friends would participate in the blog for fear of being perceived on the wrong side. But I want to share anonymously an email that I received from an African-American friend and colleague who is actually very well, it was very politically, it doesn't do it. I'm going to read it. And she, by the way, she's related to Jimmy and Percy Heath of the modern jazz quartet. So, and she said, first, I want to tell you that I'm so sorry that you've been subjected to this onslaught of accusations and vitriol, which is endemic in social media. A virtual world that allows cowardly people to spew hatred, ridicule, and often garden variety bullshit with impunity. However, I see that you have had exchanges with some of the more rational members within the field of musicology. Disagreement regarding the social role of art is inevitable. However, the conversation should be conducted constructively, although passionate discourse is also inevitable and would argue permissible. Second, I would love to meet with you in person to discuss this matter. I'm not academic, but I'm an African-American who happens to have appreciation for opera. So she came to my house and we talked for over an hour. And that's the way to do it. I mean, the fact that all these young people started expressing their frustration on tweets or on Facebook sites, excluding me instead of engaging with me, did not resolve anything. I hope that in the future, if something like this happens, they will have the courage and feel that they have the right to say, I want to talk to you one-to-one. I want to understand why you brought this in this way and how you feel about these problems. Mm. That's a constructive way of having a dialogue, of healing the wounds in our society.
That is, yeah, I think this question of how we then carry forward from the moment of friction, and that's the big question for us, is how to avoid polarization where you're literally shouting at each other and no resolve. Nothing comes out of it. No, everybody's on the defense, so nothing comes out of it. And it's related. I see, I hope we have a question here, and it's related to the broader question of musicology that I brought up and its relationship to public, participation, engagement. One of the things I frequently wonder about with musicology and academia more broadly, and this is on the chat, so I can't actually post it if other people aren't able to see it. Let's see, about musicology. online is about what certain kinds of public acts of online academic engagements, blogs, Twitters, are actually for. It often feels to me like even very well-meaning and progressive voices on this subject, myself included, are often speaking more to fellow musicologists about how to engage or not engage the public and what we should be doing as an ideal than actually talking to people in other fields and or outside of academia. And that was something I hinted out about the larger issues for musicology. Are we actually coming up with rules of engagement that in themselves are a little insular and defined by academic culture as opposed to other areas, other experiences, other ways of looking at the public, of looking at education. That would be, I think, it ties into, in a larger way, if we pull back, something I was getting at was, even though there seem to be two sides, if you pull back far enough, I still think there's something maybe missing about what it means to engage with the public. You know, how are we framing that? And how are we educating ourselves about that? How are we valuing that? Because, and Ali, you'll remember this, we not so long ago had a chapter meeting in which I was on the panel about people working in the public. At that time, you were not tenured and you said, nobody's going to care about this work. My tenure CV is not going to, nobody's going to look at this and find value in it. So this is also a rather recent sudden idea of let's get out there and do things. I mean, the fields and the typical academic places of employment for the field have not really answered this question about what musicology outside of the academy looks like, should look like, what other information, what other kinds of relationships do we need, what kind of inquiries need to happen before we're actually making it something of value.
Can I just jump in for a minute, because there's a question that's been in the chat and it looks like many of the questions are related, and I think this is a provocative question which we began with. It almost reminds me, I taught the T.S. Eliot essay, what tradition and the individual talent. I might be citing it wrong, but this comes back to what we were talking about, is responsibility. And when it comes, as you can see in the chat, when it comes to operatic repertoire, how do we utilize ethical positioning when it comes to beloved or even venerated repertoire? In the same vein, where do we draw the line? So Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann were anti-Semites. So we're going to refrain from singing their music. Ives was homophobic. Handel supported the slave trade. This person points out, I find these dialectics insufferable because you are choosing where to apply ethical constraints. And I was wondering if either of you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think we have to choose ethical constraints. Maybe it's on an individual teacher's, but I'm not going to say this is rubbish. I think that that's part of it, is that we are handed these as beloved or even venerated repertoire. And we assume that that's just it. Like this has all been tested. The quality control has made sure it's all good. And if nothing hasn't been learned, I would say it's particularly probably starting with my generation about new musicology and maybe some questions that weren't even being asked. And I think at that point, that's what I am saying, that the dialectics are insufferable, as in you suffer with them. They are uncomfortable. And I think I don't want to have a frightening crescendo here. Like you can probably hear it, but that's what I've been getting at. This isn't just merely let's apply some kind of unrelated, moral policing that doesn't belong in these. I'm saying we have learned more, and this becomes a question. I personally, in my classes, and I teach at a conservatory of music, at a very niche conservatory of music, one that has no outside relationship with a larger academic entity. It's a very small school. It has no opera program in the conservatory. So when I teach opera, I'm not teaching it to singers. So I find generally are a little more wanting to get into content. But we do ask those questions. I recently, in teaching music on stage and screen, I brought up the issue with Handel. I didn't answer the question for my students, but I said, okay, here's the question. You know, this was somebody who supported the slave trade. Moreover, let's look at an opera like Rinaldo. You have strong anti-Muslim crusade-like language, which has, as I was starting to teach after 2001, after 9/11, became even more problematic, let's say, for American audiences, for students. So I suddenly became very self-aware as I was talking about these things. When you talk about public opera houses open on joint stock economies, part of his investments were, I think it's important to say, this repertoire is implicated in a culture that has some very unattractive, even violent.
Well, I think that there is a lot of we still have the baggage of how the music history was taught. You know, when I was an undergraduate student, there was still a lot of rhetoric of the masterpieces of the great composers. Today we can approach the repertory very differently, and we can also see that it's not about Wagner, that the Ring is not about Wagner, it's about the problems that the opera presents to us. And we can approach it without fearing that if we say something critical about it, then we are not connoisseurs. You know, we can do that today. Another reason why we shouldn't, I think we should not abandon this repertory by branding it as dead white men repertory is that it has no connection whatsoever with the race and the place of origin of the repertory. So Austria might think that Mozart is their patron saint, but young Austrians are completely exhausted. You know, they don't see Mozart as their own music necessarily. I met many who listen to rap because that's their music. So we need to deconstruct this link between geographic place of origin, ethnicity of the composer, and the music itself, and say Mozart is Korean. Why? Because Koreans love Mozart. It's their music. It can be Korean.
I want to, some of these are coming through the chat, so they're not coming through Q&A. I can't really show, but I will say that we have a participant who says there's been a lot written about the problematic nature of the limited space of online forms of publication because nuance and complexity are cut down. This was actually something brought up at the very beginning. I brought this up at the beginning of our session, was that blog posts have this disadvantage, and that Pierpaolo's post lost a lot of detail that I thought would be helpful because of the kind of short word count, the severe editing of an experience or an idea that often has to happen with blog posts. So that's very well. Yeah, we are definitely, that is a point that I think is very fair and that needs to be considered with any kind of online short posts like that. Let's see. These forms of media do allow musicologists to engage with the public more easily, but only if they sacrifice the ability to create a nuanced argument. Yes, exactly. So I think that is something still to be talked about with online formats. And another question then, are we limited to Q&A sessions like this that require people to talk together in real time? That is a question, is if this isn't a more effective way of,
honestly,
as limited as it is.
I also see that there are some people are posting, are using the chat, and some people are using the QA. So it's very hard to.
I'm looking back and forth.
Both.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about this at the beginning. The reason we have the question and answer is because only we can see them, so that people can feel free to ask questions. We are also a little bit nervous given the vitriol that our conference received from Lebrecq's blog in the public sphere, that we would get some, to use a social media term, trolls. And so the chat is public. We can see your name. The question and answer only we can see, so that people can feel free to ask questions. And this also blocks any kind of vitriol, which is emblematic of what we've seen in the Musicology Now post. And I actually, if you don't mind my jumping in, can I actually return to that with a question is, do the editors of AMS, and because Pierpaolo, you said you went through 2 people, do they bear any responsibility for this?
Yeah, I mean, this is also the the question that Paula Higgins posted there, and I'm not just talking about, yes, there were editors, there were co-editors, but there were also, as I said, a number of colleagues, and nobody could see any problem with it. So it was, I didn't receive any correction except a few typos, if I remember correctly, because this was a long time ago. So, but I don't think that at some point, many of the commentators, especially on, it was on Dial M for Musicology, suspected that because I was of Italian origins, I didn't know English well enough to understand these nuances. Other comments were that I didn't know the fact that, you know, I didn't know American society well enough to understand the problems of the US. For somebody who has lived, you know, 25 years in the US, it's, yeah, you might have an accent, you might learn the language late, but I think that we need to recognize that those problems are not just related to being a foreigner. There are many native speakers were reading this before it was published and didn't see any problem. The problem was generated largely by a mode of discussion that was not interactive enough, that was polarized. That I think was the main problem.
And there were several ad hominem attacks, not just on you, but on other commenters.
Right.
As well.
Right.
Yeah, and it went back and forth. I mean, there were insults traded from, let's say, both parties. It was, or both sides. And I hate to say that, but it soon became, there were voices that were trying to cut through and say, okay, wait a minute, what is the, beyond the, okay, this wasn't great language, but how can we address this? And I get back to the question we had of, what did we learn from that? What did we actually learn about what should be doing, as Kristen brought up, Kristen Francine, and what we should be doing as an ideal than actually talking to people in other fields and or outside of academia. It was still mostly musicologists talking to musicologists, even though this is ostensibly.
And that's okay. I mean, in the end, this was a problem in the world of musicology, trying to reach out. But, you know, I had some unpleasant exchange with Bob Fink, for example. You can read it. But at some point I said, okay, enough of the blog. I'm going to write emails so we can communicate without people lurking and reading, because I think that lots of the problem, and then we had, I believe we had a constructive dialogue and we clarified many things. But the problem in that case was that we are operating within a system of power that makes us feel vulnerable when under attack on certain problems like race, sexual harassment. So in our profession, those are, if you suspect somebody of committing crimes such as those are like throwing atomic bombs. So there is an issue of power in the profession that prevents us from having actually a constructive criticism, of feeling, okay, let's put fear aside. Let's try to understand how we can make musicology more inclusive, how we can make music more accessible.
Yeah, and well, there are a couple of things coming up on questions that I think are good follow-ups, and they're still getting, I think, to this bottom line. First of all, is the conversation within the society, let's say that, and with anybody who would like to join in. I'm answering this live. The constraints of blogs quite well reflect the reluctance of scholars to first have a discussion with those they plan to disagree with in print. Couldn't it become good practice to discuss one's doubts before one goes public? And I don't know, I do think that the format, the commenting format, we've seen it with almost every type of blog across disciplines, across the world, that the comment feed seems to mostly invite some of our worst instincts. I don't think it's, I also think that this question brings up something quite interesting, which is often discussions have happened traditionally in print form. You print something and then I write something that smashes it. And there is that sense of being disconnected from one another. So you don't actually want to sit at a table with the person and and I would say questions at AMS papers work the same way. How many times I've seen someone get up there basically just to deliver their rebuttal to a paper, as opposed to invite some sense of like, well, actually, I don't agree with this. As Pierpaolo, as you brought up, I said, well, actually, I see it this way. What do you think? That would have been, it's a different way. It's an inviting the dialogue. I invite you. This is how I see it. But I've often seen in those, this aggressive takedowns. Personally, I feel like that's what I was taught was the way it's not in my nature, but it was the way you showed kind of your validity as a scholar, was be able to enter the ring. And I think that whole way of thinking probably needs to be considered as well as blog posts. I think that old style has found its way into the blog. I don't think that there's one way that people are live and one way that they're on the blog. I think that the tendency is not to sit down together and have conversations. It's funny because I have to share this. Pierpaolo, you brought up that you and Bob Fink had a tussle, and I'm loving the fact that Bob wrote, yes, we totally did XOXO. And I think that's funny because I know you both, I know Bob very well, and things can get hot, but it's not where I think either one of you wants to live, right? And there's this desire actually more for a useful dialogue. And I'll wrap that to the last thing here, which is.
No, but by the way, when at some point somebody, I don't remember whom, accused Bob Fink of being dishonest or opportunistic, I felt like I had to defend him because I knew he was honestly concerned about doing good. I mean, fixing problems. We needed to have a constructive dialogue because I wanted to do that. I went to prison not to impose Mozart, like I wanted to make it more accessible. I went there but something went wrong.
Yeah.
If I don't talk to people like Bob, who works on a different repertories, I will never get it right. I will make the same mistakes over and over and over. Since my goal is to actually, we are working with the same agenda, I think, we are working with a similar agenda in higher education, which is break these barriers, make this music as accessible as possible, respect everyone who wants to have whatever opinion about it. Well, then we must have a dialogue. Can we have a dialogue on a blog? Can we develop tools to do that constructively with new technologies? That I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question.
I think it's very relevant, and there are so often times, and I don't mean to belittle things, but where musicologists will fight over small details of research, and we can say very few people are hurt by those things. But I think what happened with the post and with other interactions that we're seeing where this could actually hurt more people and it's detrimental to the field if the field wants to be healthy and wants to have this opportunity to grow with a 21st century culture and framework. And we have another question here, which I think,
Kristi, actually, I'm so sorry to do this, but we only have till past. And I think I'm just unfortunately not going to be able to have time to answer this last question because we need to wrap up and announce the talks for next week.
All right, we can't answer it. Can we just read it to leave people go? I am just so
Sure.
they understand. I am being
Sure.
pessimistic here. Are we sure we are learning something? I fear that history is repeating itself. See, for example, the latest blog post from the UK scholar who has left academia. So I think that question of, are we sure we're learning something? That is a question for me as well.
I want to thank all the panelists so much for being compassionate and honest and engaging. And this is something we want to strive for, as many of the questions came up in the field and in humanity at large, not to be flip, but we could be an example. Next week, we are having a very similar layout with Philip Buell, talking about polarization in music theory and Schenkergate, so to speak, which Norman Lebrecht, I won't tell you to go there, has picked up on and has led to some contentiousness. So thank you again. Thank you everyone for attending and for engaging in this discussion, and hope to see many of you next week as well.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.